Hi guys, welcome to part 3 of my Imperfect Victim series for Megan Thee Stallion. Today we are talking about trauma, grief, fame, and why Megan was judged so harshly at her worst moment. So let's get started. So before that even happened, Megan Thee Stallion was already traumatized because sudden fame and the sudden death of her mother are both psychologically destabilizing events all on their own. Her mother died abruptly of brain cancer just as Megan's career was exploding, which is the kind of loss that permanently fractures your sense of identity. And that combination of rocketing to fame and losing your mom in such a traumatic way is enough to trigger PTSD even before any additional violence enters the picture. So I've talked on here on multiple occasions about fame as a traumatizing force in and of itself, but I do want to kind of bring that up here with Megan Thee Stallion. Because being famous is not just glamorous. It's inherently traumatizing because it destroys your sense of privacy, distorts your relationships, it distorts your ability to trust people. It kind of can create paranoia because people close to you will betray you and use you for money. And it basically forces you to perform stability while internally unraveling. I watched Megan's documentary a couple of years ago. It was very triggering, very good, but very, 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 very triggering, okay? And she talked about how she was at multiple like music festivals during the year that the trial was preparing to go on, and how every time she was at a festival, she had this horrible fear of basically getting pew-pewed at, and it gave her like crippling, horrible anxiety. And I actually saw her in concert a couple times that summer at a couple separate festivals. And one of the festivals I was at, Primavera Sound, like she literally referenced as like when she was doing the montage of having this horrible crushing anxiety attack. I think that that's like a perfect example of fame forcing you to have to perform stability when you don't have it. Fame also amplifies grief instead of giving you space to process it, because it becomes a topic of conversation for literally everybody. And also, interviewees are rude and they'll ask you about it. And it also attracts people to you that benefit more from your chaos and from your recovery, which I think was a big problem in Megan's life. Cough, partisan Fontaine, cough, cough. Which I think creates a predatory social environment, which I think fundamentally traumatizes celebrities. We've seen a lot of people go through this, like Lindsay Lohan and like I think Paris Hilton especially, but we'll get to her later on. Anyway, Megan was already coping through the loss of her mom through alcohol and sex. When people are traumatized, their brains are constantly seeking escape from intrusive thoughts, hyperarousal, and emotional pain. And alcohol in a lot of ways provides short-term relief for PTSD symptoms, even though it's worse in the long term, which is why trauma survivors often drink heavily. It can also function in the same way. It temporarily numbs emotional pain and it creates connection and also gives a momentary sense of control. I don't think Megan was being reckless or drinking a lot like just for fun. I think she was honestly self-medicating deep psychic pain in the only way that her nervous system knew how and the only tools that she had access to at the time. Obviously, eventually, as time went on, as she got healthier, she turned to therapy and she turned to exercise. But in that moment, in this chaotic time of her life, like who can really blame her? Oh, I don't know. All of society, I guess. And that's kind of the problem with all this. An aspect of this Tory Lanez case, there is like an unsavory component to it, which I'm not going to brush over. The Tory Lanez situation emerged out of a messy love triangle involving her and her friend Kelsey, which people basically used to imply a moral failure on Megan's part and also imply that she did not deserve empathy for what happened to her and somehow deserved to get, which, cool, thanks guys. Anyway, that what they refuse to acknowledge is that trauma will destabilize boundaries, decision making, and also your judgment in relationships. And that context, yes, is very unsavory. It does mean she wasn't a good friend to Kelsey, but Kelsey repaid her 100-fold with how she acted on the stand, okay? And it's also clinically predictable behavior for someone who basically has unprocessed grief, unprocessed trauma, and is in psychological freefall. Also, during this period of time, Megan fell out with multiple people in the industry and gained a reputation for being chaotic, volatile, and difficult. But that's not that surprising because trauma creates paranoia. It creates fight or flight. It creates reactivity, emotional volatility, and impulsive decision making, which makes maintaining relationships extremely difficult. People who only saw her during this window basically formed their entire impression of who she was during the worst psychological chapter of her life, which does not mean that her behavior was perfect and it doesn't excuse her behavior. And I'm not behind the scenes, so I don't know exactly everything that happened, but it also means that it was actually coming from somewhere. And it also means that it also just means that she's a human being who, once again, deserves empathy, which is why we're here, right? So I want to talk a little bit about why trauma makes you polarizing and combative. Trauma fractures your nervous system into survival mode, where everything feels threatening and every conflict feels existential. And it basically creates like a hair trigger temper, rapid escalation, mistrust, and an urge to cut people off or run to protect yourself. It's just the way that trauma functions. And as a CTBSD girly, I heavily relate to this, okay? These are not personality defects. They are trauma symptoms that look ugly from the outside and they are devastating from the inside because you're suffering from a deep sense of isolation and not knowing who to trust and the constant feeling of betrayal. And I think, despite the fact that Megan is an incredibly strong woman, given all that she was forced to endure, it was inevitable that she was going to hit a rock bottom. And I believe that her rock bottom was when she discovered Partisan Fontaine, name him, okay, basically cheating in her bed and humiliating her in an already violent chapter of her life. And basically, the reason why that was happening is because he was upset with what he found out on the stand about her history, which really sucks. So he essentially abandoned her in the middle of a crisis because of who she was in her past, which is terrible. And maybe Megan should have told him, but also maybe Megan was traumatized in dealing with it and didn't want the one person who she loved to judge her and betray her like he ultimately did. I think that kind of betrayal laid on top of grief, fame, trauma, and public humiliation is a kind of moment that either breaks you or forces transformation. And I think for Megan, it did force a transformation. It seemed to me after that moment, Megan began to radically change her life, where she focused on fitness, she reduced her alcohol content, and she rebuilt her sense of control and self-identity, and got her body right, seemed to get her mind right, seemed to get the treatment that she needed, and came out with some of her biggest hits of her career, Cobra and Hiss. Another thing, too, that people don't realize is that Megan was incredibly young when all this happened. She was 24 or 25 years old during all of this, which means her frontal lobe was not fully developed. And your frontal lobe basically governs impulse control, emotional regulation, and long-term planning. And her entire adult identity was basically shaped by grief, violence, loss, and fame during that exact developmental stage, when stability mattered the most. I think the saddest thing about Megan's story is that she was judged during her worst moment due to her trauma behaviors to prove that she was untrustworthy, dramatic, and morally defensive and, quote, playing victim, People judged her based on who she was during collapse instead of what she had survived, which is the defining cruelty of the imperfect victim culture. And why Megan embodies the imperfect victim thesis like so well, because an imperfect victim is someone whose suffering is dismissed because their trauma response is messy instead of respectable. And I believe Megan is a perfect example of this because she was denied grace because she was angry, chaotic, volatile, drunk, grieving, and not emotionally pristine. Her humanity was revoked at the exact moment that she needed compassion by the culture, and quite frankly, specifically by Black culture, and almost more specifically by Black female culture too. I think one of the most notable and disturbing and sad things about Megan's story is that she was judged most harshly, I found online, by a lot of Black women. And I think that is misogynoir, internalized misogynoir, because I think as Black women, there's a certain script that we are supposed to follow and that we are given to follow. And it is sort of very confining. But when women other Black women act outside of that, I think that the backlash against them, it comes from a space of resentment of the things that the humanity that we've had to be denied in order to survive in, white society. A concept in critical race theory by Derek Bell is called crabs in the barrel, where there's a self-policing that goes on that oftentimes is even more harmful than the policing that white society does for us. At the end of the day, the truth that people don't want to face is that Megan was failed by our society. Her behavior makes complete sense in context when you account for the grief, the trauma, the addiction, the fame, the betrayal, and her developmental stage. And I think the refusal to extend empathy reveals how conditional compassion is and it remains for Black women. But because of this, I think that her healing arc matters too. Her physical and emotional rebuild shows what happens when trauma survivors can get control over their nervous system again. And I think her current stability is a beautiful thing, and it's also proof that the chaos that she was experiencing was situational and not essential to who she was as a person. So the final truth about Megan Thee Stallion is that Megan is not a cautionary tale about bad behavior. She's a case study on what trauma does to young women in an unforgiving world. Her story basically exposes how misogynoir punishes Black women for coping badly instead of protecting them from harm. She's not a failed victim. She's the most honest example of what survival actually looks like. And at the end of the day, Megan Thee Stallion did not need to be perfect to deserve protection. And the fact that people think that she did is the real indictment here. Megan is a blueprint for understanding how misogynoir, trauma, and imperfect behavior intersect. And every woman in this series will echo the same moral pattern in different forms. And if you understand Megan, then you will understand why the rest of these people's stories matter. So anyway, thank you for joining me. I know this was a long one, but I appreciate your time and attention to this matter. Thank you. That was fucking hard. It was painful, torturous. I hope you guys enjoyed it though. Killed me inside to do this one though.